Thank you very much, Mar, and thank you also, Etienne, for the introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here and talk a little bit about some of the stuff which we are doing at the OECD on digital transformation. I will touch on, and you have the screen over there, there's only one, but so for those of you really far away, perhaps move up a little bit closer. But I would say I'll touch on two things. I want to say a few words about the digital transformation and why it's such a big thing and why we need to think about it. Then I'll touch a little bit about the Digital Economy Outlook, which is a publication which we put out last October. And then I want to talk a little bit about a bigger project which we are currently doing at the OECD, because we think this is really probably one of the biggest things which is going on at the moment to try and understand better. And we're really working across all the parts of the OECD to really get a better understanding of what is happening and what policy needs to do. I think the first thing to say is that we are in very much in a new phase of the digital transformation. This is unfortunately the PDF, not my PowerPoint. But basically I had two slides here. One was two components. One was basically a small shot from St. Peter's Square in 2005 and 2013, where you see the difference between basically the fact that in 2013 everybody was walking around with a smartphone. And I think we have really seen a lot of change, and the smartphone is something which basically your smartphone today has pretty much the same computing power as a supercomputer had in the mid-90s. So you're walking around with an enormous amount of power in your pocket, and that is true for companies as well in terms of the power we have to work with in terms of digital technologies. Now, obviously, there are a very wide range of technologies which we are currently looking at, and these are moving very quickly. Some are going through a bit of a hype cycle, but we have these technologies like cloud computing, the Internet of Things, artificial intelligence, big data, blockchain, 3D printing, robotics. All of these technologies are pretty much coming at the same time, which means there's an enormous amount of change happening, affecting different industries, and it is moving very quickly. I think the second thing, which is to say that we've had previous phases of digital change. We had a very big change, for instance, in the 80s and the 90s, when we saw big impacts, for instance, in wholesaling and retailing, when we saw big impacts on banking, on business services. But now pretty much every sector of the economy is being affected by digital technology. So not only some of those more private sectors, businesses, but also education, also health, also government itself, also transport. And that means that the scope of what we're seeing, the range of sectors being affected is a lot larger. And that also means, of course, that the transformation potentially can be a lot larger than what we've seen before. So what I'll do is first talk a little bit about the Digital Economy Outlook. Now, that's a publication which we put out every 2 years, covering the OECD countries. Here I have the analog copy. Obviously, there's a digital copy as well. But it really tries to look at a number of different issues to try and see what countries are doing on a number of areas of policy. So it is looking at issues like connectivity. How can we use the technology better? What are the skills that we need? What are the policy changes that we need? How do we deal with security and privacy? And how do we also coordinate some of these policies? And I just want to touch on a few issues which I think are worth talking about. The first one is connectivity. Now, I think most of you and most households actually in Europe pretty much have an internet connection today. There are still some people who don't, use the internet, but by and large, most countries in the OECD pretty much have universal coverage in terms of people having an internet connection. The same is true for firms. Most firms have an internet connection. Where we currently see some of the gaps is basically how countries are moving into new technologies. And that is particularly the case with really sort of very high-speed broadband connections. Fiber networks are very still slow to be rolled out in a number of European countries. Here you see basically the share of these fiber connections in different countries. We see very high uptake in some of the Nordic countries, also very strong growth in countries like Spain and Portugal, but also a couple of key European countries where hardly anybody at the moment is still connected by fiber networks. And Germany, for instance, is one example. We've brought it up a few times with the Chancellor. It is an issue where if you really want to move into sort of new technologies, if you want to move in the Internet of Things, we need to move to these fiber connections, and that is still something which is lagging a lot in many, many European countries. Now, what we can do about this in terms of good telecommunications policy can do a lot about this. Competition is really needed, but also we need to make sure that people in rural areas and so on are connected as well, and that's sometimes where government may need to come in. Second point I wanted to make here is that there's still digital divides in countries. I basically said, well, okay, most people are connected, but if we look really also in how the technology is being used by certain people, we still see gaps. For instance, people with lower levels of education typically do not use the internet as much as people with higher levels of education. We also see a gap between younger people and older people. Far more younger people use the internet than older people. And we see gaps also sometimes by income level. People with lower incomes don't use the internet as much. So I think this is a technology which is a network technology. The more people that are connected, the better it is for everybody. So we need to make sure that everybody does get connected and everybody has the ability to benefit from these networks. And that means we need to make sure that also people with lower incomes, lower education levels, and younger and older people are connected. So that's a little bit about connectivity, which I think is important. Second thing to say is that if we look at firms, I mentioned already, most firms are connected. Most firms do have access to broadband networks. However, if we look a little bit more in detail and see what they're using it for, we still see very big differences across firms. Firms are typically not using some of the more advanced technologies very well yet. They're not necessarily involved in selling through the internet. They're not so much also involved in buying through the internet. They don't use some of the more advanced technologies yet. And that means there is still scope to do more with the technology. And that is something that takes a lot of time to make that happen. And that is particularly the case if we're looking at small and medium-sized enterprises. This basically just looks at the average for the OECD countries. It looks at the top country, which is the little diamond at the top, and then it looks at the bottom country, which is the little bar at the bottom. And you see still a lot of variation across countries. If you're looking then at SMEs, which is where a lot of the real problems are still there, larger firms typically do use this technology and have picked it up very quickly. But if we look at SMEs, then probably often they are lagging much more. Now, this is the example of cloud computing, which is basically where a firm basically outsources some of its business processes to the cloud. And that can be to a provider like Amazon. It can be to other European cloud computing firms. But it is something where you're outsourcing some of your business processes. For an SME, in principle, this can be very attractive because you lower your cost. You don't have to buy all the equipment. However, we still see very big gaps here between countries, particularly SMEs are not always using this technology. Many reasons for that. Firms are sometimes afraid to give away too much of their data, but it is something which I think we need to work on because, it comes back to sort of this issue of making sure that everybody is using this technology to the best of our ability. The third issue I wanted to say a few words about is skills. Now, I'll come back to that later. I want to talk a little bit about the whole jobs and skills discussion, I think, which is a really fundamental discussion, which everybody is worried about, the pace of change. But we do find, I think, typically that too few people at the moment have the skills which we need to have for this environment where digital technology is becoming more and more prevalent. We need to move to an environment where people do have these skills, not only ICT skills, not only digital skills, but also more creative skills, softer skills, which are often what you really need to have to complement your technological skills. And this is just looking at the number of people using software in their offices, in their day jobs, and a lot of people that actually use these technologies don't really have the skill to use that technology properly. Now, of course, that raises the question, well, if you don't really have the skills, what are you doing with it? And I think that's again, something we need to work on. My fourth point is around policy review, and that is obviously something which, particularly here in the European Parliament, but in Brussels in general, this is a transformation that challenges many, many existing policies. We have many, many firms coming in with new business models, with new ways of doing things. And of course, Uber is the example which everybody has in their mind, but there are many, many examples of firms which are doing things in a different way. An example here is location often doesn't matter anymore. You can now be educated to some extent by basically going online and buying courses or going onto courses from Harvard University. You can go onto courses from all around the world. How do we deal with that? How do we deal with a system with cases like that where location no longer matters? We have the same problem with tax, where also, in many cases now, firms, it is not clear anymore where firms are producing, where they're creating value, where we need to tax them. And that is something the OECD is working on very hard at the moment. Second example here is about from ownership to services, which is the issue of mobility. More and more people are not that interested in buying a car anymore, or necessarily buying certain things. If we can share it, if we can have access to it, if we can have access to the service, that also can sometimes be an example of what we want to do. And again, this raises issues about how do we deal with transport policy, how do we deal with mobility policies, how do we deal with rental, how do we deal with Airbnb, how do we deal with some of these things which are sometimes quite complex. And there are many examples like that. The last one here is Upwork, where we're moving from employment in some cases to gigs. People are selling part of their employment services for a little while. Again, it raises questions about for policy, which we are still struggling with. And I think this is a really fundamental shift which we're seeing in many cases, where this digital transformation challenges many things which we're used to doing. It challenges the way the economy works, and we're still struggling to keep up with the changes that are happening to us. So I'm not responding to all of these issues. I'm not saying how we should deal with it. I'm just saying there is a lot changing at the moment which we're struggling with. Final 2 points before I move to a couple of broader issues is security and privacy. These, of course, are different issues, difficult issues as well. More and more of what we are doing is online. More and more what firms doing is online. And more we are being challenged by the fact that not all of this is secure, not all of it is private, and we are still struggling how to deal with this. I think in some of the work which we've done at the OECD, we realize that security will never be an absolute thing. It will never be something that we can always sort of assure for everybody, but we need to manage that. We need to manage the fact that security is not always an absolute thing and move forward. And this is just a little graph showing the number of people in different countries which have dealt with digital security. So my final point on the digital economy outlook is basically about strategic coordination. And I think this is an issue which we're seeing in many OECD countries, is that governments are still struggling how to deal with this new digital agenda. Where do you put it? Who is in charge? Is it a minister dealing with a digital economy? Is it the Prime Minister's office? Where do we put it? And I think we're still not struggling how to figure that out, because this is now affecting every area. It's not just economy, it's transport, it's energy, it's health, it's education. Every part of our economy is being affected by the digital economy, and we still don't quite know where to put that agenda. We just know it's really of great importance, which probably means it needs to be at as high a level as possible to make sure we get this right. So a couple of messages from this digital economy outlook, which I wanted to mention, is first, basically, make sure that everybody is connected. Make sure that also people have connectivity to these high fiber networks. Make sure we use this technology efficiently. That's where still the gaps are. People are there. We have it often, but we don't use it very much. Look at the skills agenda, which is really, really important to get right. Look at these policy frameworks, because often they're not right anymore for what we're trying to do. Look at how we innovate going forward. Look at the risks in some detail, and then try to develop more coherent government strategies. So that's a little bit on the digital economy outlook. Let me very quickly move into what I wanted to say more broadly. We've had a long agenda on the digital economy. We've been working at the OECD probably on digital economy issues for about 30 years, and we had a big conference on ministerial level a year and a half ago. I think what we realized that we need a much more strategic view and strategic thinking about this digital agenda. We need to be much more proactive. I think in many cases we're still seeing that we are struggling to keep up. The technology is moving so enormously fast that we have difficulty keeping up with how fast it is moving. We need to try and look ahead a little bit more, try and see where this is going, and think a little bit further ahead on how we're moving. We think this is a huge potential, what we can do here. There's a huge potential in how we are delivering services, how we are helping people in different countries, how we are targeting policies, how we are improving productivity, but also there is a realization that a lot of this will be very disruptive. And I think we need to pull together at the government level and also the European level to make sure we realize the potential of this technology. So we have a big project at the OECD, which was mandated by ministers a little while ago, to understand better what this digital transformation means, what it is really trying to do, to understand its impacts on the economy and society. We want to help provide policymakers with the tools to really make this work, and we also want to help overcome the gap that we are seeing between technology and policy, because it is very hard for policymakers to keep up with the rapid speed of change. I don't want to talk about all of it. We have a lot of different work going on, and here's just a few of the reports that have come out already, looking at issues like autonomous transport, digitalization and energy, artificial, sort of algorithmic transparency and competition, which is, for those of you into competition, is a complex issue, tax policy issues, skills issues. All of these things are things which we are looking at. I just want to touch on two issues which I think are crucial in this agenda. The first one is the issue of productivity, because if we want to try and make sure that this digital transformation works, we need to make sure also that it improves productivity growth. Productivity is really what is driving incomes, it's driving wages in different countries, and we've really seen a big slowdown in productivity growth in the OECD and in Europe as well in recent years. There's a very big debate about that, and here are just a few of the key people in this discussion, basically saying, well, we have this massive explosion of technological change. We have all these technologies, and why is it not showing up in productivity growth? And I think that's a debate which we need to look at very carefully, because if we want to see these benefits, it does need to, at some point in time, be reflected in productivity growth. We don't see it quite now. What we are doing at the OECD is trying to look a little bit in more detail at this picture. And what we're finding is that the biggest firms in the world, the frontier firms, they are still facing very rapid productivity growth. They are still doing great, but a lot of the rest of the economy has great difficulty keeping up. And that probably shows there is something going on here, in the sense that there is a potential for productivity growth, but it is not easy. It is not easy to capture it, because it is about more than the technology itself. It is also about sort of some of the organizational changes. It's about skills. It's about process innovation. It's about a lot of other things that firms need to do to turn this technology into productivity. So what we are looking at here is basically that this diffusion, and I mentioned that in the beginning, the diffusion of some of these technologies is only starting. It's only still happening very slowly. A lot of firms will still need more time, and it will take time, particularly for the SME. So it will time also for the productivity impacts to show up a little bit further. It's never just about the technology. I think we talk too much about the technologies. We are sometimes blinded by what artificial intelligence could do in potential, but it takes time also to translate that within a firm and turn it into real change. And that means you need to look at business models, you need to look at other types of things that will take a lot more time. And this is also, I think, where the policy agenda can help to really strengthen investment and to help firms grow. Let me end by saying a few words about jobs, because I think that's the final issue which I think really we need to think a lot about. We've done work recently at the OECD to look very carefully at what types of jobs are most affected by the whole pace of technological change, by automation that is happening. And we do see that a large number of jobs, but probably only about 10-15% of jobs, are really at the risk of automation in a relatively short period of time, of about 10 to 15 years. These are the jobs where basically a lot of the tasks that people do are quite routine, are quite capable of being automated. Then there are probably another 30% or so of people who have where probably jobs will change quite a lot, because a lot of the tasks could change, but probably not to the extent that the job will be completely disappearing. So a lot of change to come, but also I think we need to realize that's the negative side. That's the side of job losses. But there's also a lot of job creation coming into the economy all the time. And this is just the example of electronic commerce in the United States, where the interesting thing is that if you look at what happened in the US since the crisis, that as many jobs have been created in electronic commerce as have been lost in traditional retailing. Now, a lot of this is Amazon, but it's not only Amazon, but we do see that sometimes there are these other jobs that are being created in other parts of the economy where losses happen in somewhere else. So we need to look at this in a balanced perspective and not only focus on the job losses. What we do know is that there is a lot of what we call job polarization happening in many countries, which means what we've seen is that a lot of jobs are being created on the high skill end. People with higher levels of education tend to do quite good. We also see some jobs being created with lower skills. The job losses tend to be really with the people with middle skills. So we have this polarization of jobs where some jobs are really disappearing in many countries. I think, and I mentioned this previously already, we need new skills. We need different skills for everybody. And that's really a big agenda for everybody to work on. I mentioned earlier on already, many people do not have the skills right now to really compete in an environment where more and more digital technology will come will come forward. And this is not only about ICT skills, it is also about softer skills, about creativity, it's about learning, and it's also about learning to learn. Because I think what we know now is that what you were taught in school, in high school, and university will never be enough anymore for the future. You will need to continue to learn when you go forward. And that also means that we will need to have the capability to do that going forward. Now, that is difficult, particularly for a lot of older people who often, where it is difficult and where we may really see some of the problems. And we also see, for instance, that some people just don't have the basic skills, the basic levels of education to learn. For instance, we have a lot of people still also in European countries who have very low levels of literacy, low levels of numeracy, which means it is very hard to build on that and to learn. And also, a lot of the people who have the most need of learning don't get it. Most of the training which firms are giving, which also governments are often given, goes to higher skilled workers, it goes to middle skilled workers, it doesn't go to lower skilled workers. And of course that means we really risk a part of the population to drop out. So let me end here and just say that I think investment in skills will be key for this. It is something which we really need to get right to make sure that everybody does get the skills. Lifelong learning will have to become a reality for all. We've been talking about this for decades, but it will really need to happen for everybody very soon. We will need new skills. We also will need to help people to cope with change because some people will be losing their job and we need to help them find another one. And we will need to probably also work on social protection because there will be people as well, and we're seeing that with gig work, for instance, that some people are no longer sort of in the normal work of the economy. So let me end there just to say that this project is underway at the moment. There is a lot you can find on our website. We have an enormous amount of work going on to really try and understand what is happening with this whole digital transformation, how it is affecting our economy, how it is affecting jobs, how it is affecting skills, how it is affecting all sorts of parts of the economy, and there will be a lot, I think, coming out of that. But we want to be practical here. We want to provide policymakers with practical tools of things they can do back home to improve their chances of have success in this area. And that is about connectivity, on trying to build skills, trying to really make sure that this is something that works for everybody. So I'll leave you with that. You have my email address there. You also can find a lot more on our website, and please don't hesitate to get in touch. And thank you for your attention. I hope I stick more to time. Thank you.